Welcome to the second lecture on Phonetics and Phonology, a broad overview, an NPTEL MOOC course. So, in this unit, we will cover the sounds of the world's languages. While doing so, we attempt to discuss the phonetic diversity in the world's languages. And in lecture 1, we talked about how there are diverse languages in the world and where many languages are threatened because of various economic reasons and because of the pressure on land and people. More and more people are speaking the larger languages. So as a result, about half of the world's people speak one of the 10 largest languages. So the fear is that as we fear loss of biodiversity in the world, the loss of languages will lead to similar crisis in understanding the cognitive structure of the human brain, and the human languages are an integral part of our cognitive structure, and such loss will be a great loss to humanity. And to study the phonetic diversity, we talked about place of articulation and different locations of articulation, the 5 major parts of the vocal tract, the movable parts, and the 17 articulatory gestures that was shown in places of articulation, and the 9 regions that are the target areas as shown in the diagram in figure 2. So we talked about place of articulation as targets, and we talked about how the coronal region can be divided into the tip of the tongue, the blade of the tongue, targeting different regions, and how we can have sounds that we see in very few languages like linguolabials that we saw in vowel and linguolabials in Tonga, and we also saw other differences in articulation like retroflexion, which are seen in some language groups, especially in South Asia, and also retroflexion is seen in Austronesian languages as well as a few other languages. And we also saw that labials, dentals, coronals, the entire coronal region from the dental till the retroflex region have specific ways in which the tongue is used. So it could be either apical, laminal, or dorsal. And then we looked at the gestures for that results in the movement of the tongue or the movable articulators moving towards a particular target area. And we stopped at the palatal region in the last class, and we saw how in languages can have dentialveolar, as in ngo, which can have laminal, dentialveolar, palatalveolar, palatal, and velar, 4 regions that the stops can contrast. Now let us move on to other places of articulation. So after palatal, so we can have languages can also have uvular and pharyngeal fricative. So Hebrew can contrast in terms of uvular and
nahar, la.
Let us play a few Hebrew sounds to hear how different they sound.
Chimia, hem, hor, hem, mahar,
So initial
mahar,
uvular, pharyngeal, and glottal.
mahar,
Uvular,
nahar,
pharyngeal,
nahar,
glottal.
lach,
Final,
lach,
uvular,
lach,
pharyngeal,
la,
and glottal.
hem,
So which means even in the dorsal region we can have a 3-way distinction, as we saw that even with regard to coronals, languages can have dental and alveolar and palatal alveolar in a language, and even in the dorsal region there can be a few contrasts, as we see that there could be uvular, pharyngeal and glottal contrasts in a language such as Hebrew. So in Quechua is another language which has pharyngeal sounds. So
Chaka, 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 Kuyui, 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 Gayu, Kayu, Kayu.
we will come to the symbol which is used here, that is the apostrophe that is used to show these sounds. Epiglottis. So the epiglottis moves to the back wall of the pharynx. That's how epiglottal sounds are produced. They are very rarely seen in fricatives, and the phonemic contrast between pharyngeal and epiglottal place is known to be extremely rare. And let us listen to a few epiglottals in Idoma, a language spoken in Nigeria.
Aba, Aba, Ama, Aba.
These are the epiglottals in Agul. Agul is spoken in Dagestan near the Caspian Sea in Russia.
No.
This is a voice pharyngeal fricative.
No.
Voiceless pharyngeal fricative.
No.
Voiceless epiglottal fricative.
No.
And a voiceless epiglottal stop. So now let us look at a few other types of other places of articulation. We have not heard velar stops, but velars are possible in as stops, as nasals, as fricatives and as approximants. And other sounds which we have talked about before is that of lingolabials, which are formed by touching the blade of the tongue to the upper lip. And here are some lingolabial examples from Venin Tot. Finally, going back to the coronal contrast, we want to see how many stop contrasts can a language possibly have. So the largest number of stop contrasts that is seen in a language called Yan-Vuya, and we have Yan-Vuya data from the Ladefoged and Madison repository, and we can see the 7 place stop place contrast in Yan-Vuya, and Yan-Vuya has bilabial, laminal dental, apical alveolar, apical retroflex. So all these coronal sounds, and then palato-alveolar, and then a velar and a front velar as well as a back velar. So finally, that was the front velar, and this is the back velar. So now we can see that apart from glottals, pharyngeals, uvulars, velars can also there can be contrast in language like Yan-Vuya. We can have a contrast between a front velar and a back velar. So these are, and again a language can have 4 different ways in which coronals can contrast, that is a dental T, a T, alveolar, a Th and a T, and a retroflex T, and a palato-alveolar Ch. So if a language, so these are the common contrasts that we see in languages. So the languages can have dental alveolar, so it's not very common to have both a dental and an alveolar contrast, but that is also seen, as we saw examples. But most commonly either the dental or alveolar place of articulation, and it's common to have a dental alveolar and velar, and if there is a third contrast, then it is most common to have a palatal or uvular contrast. And if there are 4th or 5th contrast, and we can have language can have a retroflex as a fourth way, and sometimes labio-velar. So this is the 5-way contrast that stops that we can see it stops contrasting in languages. However, we also saw Yan Viva, which had 7-way stop contrast. So that was the place of articulation, and we saw that we can have coronals, we can have dorsals, we can have radicals, and we will summarize all the places of articulation towards the end of this lecture. Manner of articulation. We have seen manner of articulation in the previous lecture on phonetics. Articulatory phonetic stops require complete closure. Nasals also require complete closure if there are stops, nasal stops, but then the velum is lowered and air is released through the nose. And then we have rapid sort of vibrating, beating motion for the production of trills. And then we have tap or flap, and then we have fricative, where we have the occlusion is not that like that of the stop, where it is not complete closure, but it's partial and slow release. And we also saw that there could be a difference between centrality and laterality in languages. So we can also have lateral fricatives where the air is released from both sides of the articulator. Then we can have approximants where we don't have complete occlusion, and we have a very the occlusion is not as narrow as that of stops or fricatives. And then we have lateral ones, and we have central and lateral approximants. So there are 2 lateral fricatives, and there are 4 lateral approximants in the languages of the world. Now, what are the main things that we need to consider when we are studying sounds? We saw place of articulation, which is number 4 here to a large extent. We saw manner of articulation. There are a couple of more things which give the sounds their shape and their color. So the things which are important apart from place of articulation, manner of articulation, is the airstream mechanism, the glottal state, the part of the tongue, laminal or apical or subapical, etc., and centrality and nasality are also these 7 aspects give the consonant sounds their particular shape and flavor and color actually. And so even though we have studied in our basic course on phonetics that the 3 things, place of articulation, manner of articulation, glottis, which are most important, but now we see that there are additional factors which have to be taken into account while studying consonants, and apart from the 3 major factors, and all these 7 aspects play their role in the production of consonants. Let us see something that we have not seen so far. For instance, let us see voiceless nasals. As we know, nasals involve the release of air through the nasal cavity because the lowering of the velum, and there is already another closure in the vocal tract. So nasalization and fricatives are not compatible, and the existence of nasal fricatives is very often disputed. However, it's possible to have nasals which are voiceless. These are voiceless nasals from Burmese. Burmese can have contrastive nasals which are along the places of articulation of bilabial, dental, palatal and velar. And in all these places of articulation, they can contrast based on the state of the glottis, that is voiceless versus voiced. So Burmese has voiceless and voiced nasals in all the places of articulation possible for the nasals, that is bilabial, dental, palatal and velar. That's a bilabial voiceless nasal. Bilabial dental nasal,
na, nya,
bilabial,
nya,
palatal nasal,
nya, nya,
that's a bilabial velar nasal. And all these nasals
nya,
that you heard were,
na,
all these nasals that you heard were voiceless nasals. So when you heard the voiceless nasals, you heard a whispering sound along with the production of nasal, and that is a characteristic of voiceless sonorants. So another manner of articulation that we have not discussed at all so far is that of trills. So trills involve two articulators which open and close against each other rapidly and vigorously. So Kele is a language which is spoken in the island of Manus, which is north of New Guinea. Kele has both bilabial and alveolar trills. Let me play the bilabial and alveolar trills.
Bulim, ruin, ndrkei,
Okay, so those were the bilabial,
brunkei,
that's bilabial,
ruin,
this is alveolar. So now we have seen voiceless nasals and trills which are bilabial or alveolar, and something which we had not seen so far, and other aspects which we will cover is that of the airstream mechanism, that is pulmonic, glottalic or velaric, that languages can contrast. And importantly, another aspect that we have to consider in this lecture is that of airstream direction, which also gives a particular shape and color and flavor of sounds, and which may not be available in the languages which are most commonly seen or spoken in the languages of the world. So the airstream mechanism, pulmonic egressive airstream mechanism, is the one which is most commonly employed for the production of sounds. However, there are sounds which do not use the pulmonic egressive airstream mechanism, and they can be glottalic, they can be velaric as well. And for the production of the pulmonic airstream mechanism, aggressive, the air is pushed out of the lungs, and then the vocal tract gives the shape to the sounds which are produced. So all normal sounds are produced by the pulmonic airstream mechanism, and also then there are others like the glottalic, where the airstream is aggressive and can produce sounds like ejectives, and we have mostly voiceless aggressive sounds. And then we have, please note that this is the symbol that was used for the Quechua ejectives with the apostrophe, which we said that we will discuss later in the last lecture. And we already heard a few ejectives in Quechua in the previous lecture. And the other air direction that is possible from the glottalic airstream mechanism is that of ingressive, and the stop consonants can be implosives, and they are mostly voiced. So the glottalic airstream produces sounds both in the aggressive, and that is the air flowing out, and ingressive, that is the air sucked in, and in both directions sounds are produced. In the velaric airstream mechanism, sounds are produced with the air which is sucked inside the velaric region, and what is produced with that sound, with that air by the velaric airstream is called clicks. So these are the three airstream mechanisms, and of which pulmonic is the most commonly used, and then there is glottalic and velaric. So talking now about contrast and parameters. Making speech sounds involves the airstream mechanism, moving air by exhaling from lungs, and the pulmonic egressive airstream, the glottalic egressive airstream, and ejective sounds, closures in the vocal tract and the vocal folds, and compressed air released with high pressure from oral closure. So, this is how contrast happens as a result of the use of these airstream mechanisms. Let us look at another group of sounds which are found in some languages. So, here we have Syrian Arabic. So, in Arabic, it is in some varieties of Arabic, we find differences in the way obstruents are produced, and these are called emphatics. So, what are emphatics? Emphatics are earlier obstruents which now either have a palatalized, glottalized, or laryngalized sound. So, they have a secondary articulation, and that makes them emphatic. So, there is difference between plain and emphatic consonants in Syrian Arabic. So, let us look at a few.
Tar.
That's a plain obstruent, a plain stop sound, plosive sound, and this is an emphatic which is glottalized.
Tar.
So, this is a voiceless alveolar plosive in Syrian Arabic, which can contrast based on whether it is an emphatic or a non-emphatic. So, it's a plosive, either it's
Tar.
this one
Tar.
or this one with a glottalized quality to it. So, another one here is the voiced alveolar plosive, which can be either a plain one or it can be an emphatic one.
Darb. Darb. Darb.
Again, these fricatives which can be either plain or emphatic.
Safe. 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 Zil. Zil.
And then there are the Syrian Arabic uvulars. So, the Arabic uvulars can be either plosives or they can be fricatives, like the ones that we see on the screen. They can be along the place at the place of articulation being pharyngeal or glottal. And for the plosive, for the fricatives, we also have a uvular place of articulation, and here we have one example of a fricative which is uvular.
Khali.
So, that's a voiceless uvular fricative.
Ghali.
That's a voiced uvular fricative. So, both examples are from Syrian Arabic. Then there are the pharyngeal fricatives in this variety of Arabic. So, again we can have the fricative which is non-emphatic, like a plain one, and an emphatic one.
Hali. Ali. Qasi.
So, we can also have a voiceless pharyngeal plosive,
Amal.
a voiceless glottal plosive, etc. So, a dialect of Hebrew also has uvular and pharyngeal,
Khimiya.
and some of these will be played, and the distinction here is again uvular,
Hor. Hem.
and glottal.
Hem. Hor. Khimiya. Hor. Hor. Hem. Hem. Mahar. Nahar. Nahar. Lach. Lah.
So, here we can see
Nahar.
the uvular sound, the pharyngeal sound.
Nahar.
Sounds can be contrastive.
Nahar.
Earlier, we saw that the uvular fricatives in Arabic, the uvular, pharyngeal, and glottal sounds are contrast among the fricatives. So, in the plosives, we have pharyngeal and glottal. Apart from that, we also have emphatic sounds which are obstruents, but which have a glottalized or glottalized can be glottalized, pharyngalized or laryngalized depending on various other factors, mostly historical. So, now we see that in Hebrew there can be there is the Arabic variety that contrasts with a pharyngeal fricative and so glottal fricative and glottal stop. Quechua also has uvular sounds, and we will play these Quechua sounds, and Quechua will be important to talk about another type of sounds called epiglottals. So here.
Aka, kuyui, 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 galu.
Epiglottal. So these sounds which are produced towards the back of the mouth, where the epiglottis makes a constriction to the back wall of the pharynx. These are called epiglottals, and they're rarely found in fricatives. And what is often found is phonemic contrast between pharyngeal. So what is often not found is a pharyngeal and an epiglottal contrast. So these examples are from epiglottals in Agul. Agul is spoken in Dagestan near the Caspian Sea in Russia. The first one was a voiced pharyngeal fricative. The second is a voiceless pharyngeal fricative. And the voiceless epiglottal fricative and a voiceless epiglottal stop. So another type of sound are what we have is labial velars, and you will hear that in a language called Idoma, spoken in Nigeria. Here the second sound is the labial velar, and you can see that in Idoma, among labials we have labial, we have labial velar, and we also have labialized apart from a velar sound.
Abba, Abba, Amma, Abba,
And
Abba.
this is the labial velar sound. We can see the symbol here that is used for the labial velar, that we use this diacritic to show that it's one sound which is both labial and a velar. As you can see in the text here, that one velar sound, one labial sound, one velar, one labial, one velar, one labial is put together by a diacritic on top. So then among the back sounds we also have velars. So velars can be stops, nasals, fricatives and approximants. So velar stops and velar nasals are quite common across languages. Also the velar fricatives and the velar approximants may not be very common, but these are definitely the stop contrasts are found in plenty of languages of the world. So lingolabial was a sound that we talked about in the beginning of this lecture. So going now to the front part of our articulation system, let us review a few of the sounds there. Lingolabials are formed by touching the blade of the tongue to the upper lip. So now that we have seen epiglottals, pharyngeals, uvulars, velars, which are the back sounds produced in the back region, let us look at lingolabials. So these are the three bilabial lingolabials in Venin thought.
Tatay, Limak, Lavat.
So again, that was lingolabials are rare in the languages of the world. And talking about the rare sounds in the front part, we have the coronals, and among coronals there can be languages like Yanvua and a few other languages which have at least 7 stop place contrasts in the coronal region alone. So So these are the yan viva stop contrast, and all of them till the palatoalveolar, the apical retroflex, apical alveolar, dental, bilabial are the coronal contrast, and there are two back sounds. One is a front velar and one is a back velar. That's a bilabial, laminal dental, apical alveolar, apical retroflex, palatoalveolar, and a front velar versus a back velar. So talking about contrasts in the coronal region, we have languages like Nungubuyu, so where the stop contrast can be seen in among the dental, alveolar, retroflex and palatoalveolar. So these are the gestures that you see here for the dental, for the alveolar, for the retroflex and the palatoalveolar, and it is possible. So even though there are not a lot of languages which contrast the dental with the alveolar, because those places of articulations are quite close in the vocal tract, but they are not seen. They are seen in quite a few languages, and here we have one language which contrasts with dental and alveolar and retroflex and also a palatoalveolar. So talking about contrast, and in languages dental and alveolar, most often if there is a dental contrast, then an alveolar contrast is not there. So this is summarizing the most common inventories. It's not to say that the dental and alveolar contrast does not exist. As we have just seen, it does exist. However, most commonly, if there is a dental stop, then the corresponding alveolar stop or fricative is not there. So if that is there, if a dental and alveolar or alveolar stop or fricative contrast is there, then very often among the stops velar is also found. And if there is a third contrast, then it's common to find the palatoalveolar, palatal or uvular if some languages have very many back contrasts. Then if there is sometimes another place of articulation, that could be retroflex, and sometimes it could be labial velar. So these are the common patterns seen in the languages of the world, but as we have seen, there are so many variations that are possible to have in among the places of articulation, that you can have lingolabials, that you can have other places like pharyngeals, epiglottals, etc., and which are not the most commonly seen contrasts in the languages of the world. But we have covered the rare contrasts, as well as we are trying to give you an overview of not just the rare contrast, but also what is generally seen in the languages of the world. So before we go on to other aspects of sound production, so let us see a few other things like laterality versus centrality. So a lateral sound is when air passes out through the sides. Central are the ones when air passes out centrally. Now, talking about the various aspects of sound production, we just saw lateral versus central. There are other things as well. So when we discussed articulatory phonetics, if you recall, then we said that the three most important things which help you distinguish consonants is place of articulation, manner of articulation, and state of the glottis. But as we see now that there may be quite a few other properties in consonants which also give consonants their particular shape and their particular distinctive properties. So, and that is not just because of a place of articulation, manner of articulation. There can be other things like airstream mechanism, the direction of airstream also. So whether it's the airstream which is coming in, or it's the airstream which is exhale, so inhale or exhale. So, and the mechanism which is used, is it the pharyngeal, the glottalized, or the velarized airstream mechanism. And glottal state which we already know, but apart from the glottal state of voiced and voiceless, there could be other phonation differences. So it could be both for vowels and consonants. Vowels and consonants can be both breathy, they can be creaky. Apart from the modal phonation, voicing, and the most open state of the glottis, that is voiceless, and the most closed state of that of the glottal stop, there could be other properties that give consonants their distinctive features, and consonants as well as vowels. And the other aspect is which we studied, which we looked at in the beginning of this lecture, is that of part of tongue. Is it apical, laminal, subapical, is it dorsal? All those properties also give consonants their particular distinctive properties. So place of articulation, and remember, there is not just primary place of articulation, there could be also secondary, as we saw in the emphatic consonants in Syrian Arabic, and they could be, and in depending on the language, you could have laryngealized, you could have pharyngeal, you could have glottalized consonants, which is, and apart from the primary place of articulation, they could also be secondary. And of course, manner of articulation is very important. And the other aspect is centrality, central or lateral release. And then there is the other aspect which we could see in both consonants and vowels, is that of nasality, that the velum lowers and releases air through the nasal cavity, and that gives consonants and vowels another distinctive property. So these are from Ladefoged, Sounds of the World's Languages. We find voiceless nasals in Burmese, also in Angami. So these are voiceless nasals in Burmese. The examples and the sound files are all from Ladefoged.
Na, 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 nya, nya.
So one is bilabial, one is dental, one is palatal, and one is velar. These are all the voiceless nasals.
Na,
This is voice bilabial,
na,
voice dental,
nya,
voice palatal,
nya, nya.
velar. And then we have another manner which is trills, where two articulators open and close against each other rapidly. And the example is from Kele, which has both bilabial and alveolar trills. So here are some Kele examples of bilabial and alveolar trills. The first examples are bilabial, the second ones that you hear are alveolar.
Pulim Brankei Pulim Ruin Nderkei.
So another aspect is that of centrality versus central versus lateral, which we talked about when we were talking about the properties of consonants, centrality. So there can be another property, not exactly a manner, but a property of laterals. So this is Kaitij is an Australian language. It's the Arandic group of the Pama-Nyungan branch, spoken in the Northern Territory. So here, these examples on top are the laminal dental, and then we have apical alveolar, and then apical post-alveolar, and laminal post-alveolar. So these are these are examples that we see of laterals, which could be laminal dental, like the examples here, which could be apical alveolar, as in the examples here, which could be apical post-alveolar, and which could be laminal post-alveolar. And all of these differences exist in language called Khaitij. Now we come to one of the main aspects that which gives consonants and vowels their particular the way that one of the very important things, so which will distinguish consonants and vowels, and also because not just because of the distinctive property, but also because it the airstream mechanism is almost the most basic aspect in the production of consonants. So because most of sounds that are produced in languages of the world are almost always pulmonic, and that's how humans speak, with the pulmonic egressive airstream. Now importantly, it's not always that sounds are produced with the pulmonic egressive airstream, and there are a few languages which use the glottalic and velaric airstreams also, producing very interesting, particular and unique kind of sounds. So we have to remember that the pulmonic egressive is the most commonly used the manner airstream mechanism, and almost all sounds that we produce are the result of the pulmonic egressive airstream mechanism. So here is our pulmonic egressive, and then we have the glottalic and we have the velaric. So pulmonic egressive, normally almost all sounds that we produce are pulmonic egressive, and then with the glottalic airstream, the two ways possible, egressive and ingressive. With the egressive airstream mechanism, we produce ejectives. With the ingressive, we produce voiced implosives. So ejectives are mostly voiceless and implosives are mostly voiced. And then in the velaric airstream, only at the ingressive direction is possible, and in this clicks are produced, and clicks can be both voiceless and voiced. So making speech sounds involves an airstream mechanism which we know from the beginning of this course, and we moving air by exhaling from the lungs, the pulmonic egressive airstream manages to produce most of the sounds, but then there is the aggressive glottalic egressive, and there's which involves closures in the vocal tract and vocal folds. Compressed air is released with high pressure from oral closure, and then ejectives are made without air flowing out of the lungs. So this is the air in the closed glottis. And as we have seen in the examples, the Quechua examples before, we had seen a few ejectives, and the ejectives are symbolized. So Quechua
Chaka.
ejectives, let us play the Quechua ejectives again.
Chaka, Kuyui, Kuyui, Gayu, Gayu,
So those are the palatal-alveolar, velar, uvular, and these are the ejective sounds.
Aka, Kuyui, Kuyui, Ayu,
That is the uvular ejective. This is the
Kuyui,
velar ejective.
Aka,
This is the palatal-alveolar ejective. Now, the airstream mechanism in the glottis can also produce sounds. So how does that happen? So the glottis is closed, a stop closure is made. So first the glottis is closed, and then there's a stop closure, and the glottis is raised, as a result of which the air is compressed in the supraglottal cavity, and then this is released. As is usual for all stops, there is complete closure and release. Here additionally there is a raising of the glottis, and the air rushes out of the vocal tract. From the high pressure region, there is a low pressure region created, as a result of which a glottal stop is produced, and sounds which are produced with the glottalic egressive airstream mechanism, they are always very the loud sounds, and we heard the Quechua examples. And apart from the glottalic egressives, we can also make from the glottalic region, another kind of sounds are possible, which are the implosives. So, implosives can also be made when air comes into the mouth. So, remember, for the ejectives the glottis is raised, for the implosives the glottis is lowered. So, the dropping the closed glottis and an obstruction for the stops, similar to the ejective or stops, there is an obstruction, and sounds made in this way with the lowered glottis is they are called implosives, and these are examples from Sindhi.
Bunny, bun, bun, gun.
So, again the glottalic ingressive airstream produces implosives, which the air forced into the mouth, closure in mouth and at the vocal folds, and a downward movement of the larynx, and the result is a lowered pressure and the expansion of the vocal cord, and strong vibrations because of this closure of the glottal of the larynx, and as a result we have ingressive. So, air which rushes into the mouth, the glottis is lowered, causing creating a lowered pressure, and the larynx is lowered, and it's causing lowered pressure, and as a result there is some expansion of the vocal tract leading to strong vibrations. This is how ingressives, glottalic ingressive airstream, which results in implosives, are produced. This brings us to the final airstream mechanism that we will discuss, the velaric ingressive sounds, and these sounds are called clicks. So, with the velaric airstream only the ingressive direction is possible. So, the egressive is not possible, which means the air coming into the velaric region. So, clicks, they are either dental, alveopalatal, alveolar lateral. These are from Xhosa in southwestern Africa. So, this is a diagram showing the movement involved in making a click. So, the dark area shows the cavity enclosed when the closures are formed. The light is before the release. So, it's a very small area, and then the area is made bigger, and then there is a release. And the dashed line shows the lowered tongue position. So, the tongue goes up and down before the release. So, another important aspect of clicks is that there are two closures. So, here the back of the tongue raises to make a closure, and there is a front, the tongue tip goes up to form a closure, and as a result this is an alveolar click. So, while both closures are held, the body of the tongue moves down, decreasing the pressure of the air in the front part of the mouth. So, the tongue tip lowers so that air rushes into the mouth. So, these are the four gestures involved. The tongue tip goes up, the back of the tongue raises to make a closure, and both closures are held, and then the body of the tongue goes up, and first the release happens from the tongue tip, and that's how a loud sound is produced. A back closure is released. So, as we have just seen, clicks involve two closures, anterior and posterior closure, and a pocket of air is created, and when the front closure is released, air rushes into the mouth, and a negative pressure and rapid airflow creates a loud sound. So, two closures and a pocket of air created, and when the front closure is released, the air rushes into the mouth. So, this is the reason a negative pressure is created and there is a rapid inflow. So, as you can imagine, if there is an alveolar click, the front closure of the tongue will be in the alveolar region. So, as usual, there will be two oral closures, and there will be air rarefaction, which we just studied, the negative pressure which we just saw, the negative pressure because the tongue is pulled down, and the front closure is released after that, and the air rushes in to equalize the pressure, and that creates the, and after the back closure is, oral closure is released, a very loud sound is produced. So these are clicks in isiZulu, and we can see that they have three regions, three places of articulation, that is dental, alveopalatal and alveolar lateral.
Hlanza,
So this is the voiceless unaspirated velar. This is the dental.
Kaka, Kaka,
So this is the dental, this is the alveolar, and this is the alveolar lateral. So what we can see here in the spectrograms is that if in the alveopalatal, which is clear, we can see the two releases in the spectrogram, and we can see that also in the dental region, the two releases because of the two closures and two releases which are involved in clicks. And also another one here,
Kaka, 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 Toba, Toba, Toba,
dental, alveopalatal and lateral.
Isinqi, Isinqa, Isinxele.
So these are the movements in the production of clicks. So we have bilabials here, so we can see the pocket of air created, tongue lowered and a release after that, dental, and then we can see the pocket of air created, again tongue lowered. For the alveolar, again we see the tongue making an occlusion here at the alveolar region, pocket of air created, and then lowered, which is responsible for the negative energy, so which is lowered pressure as the air rushes in after the front closure is released. This is the palatal, this is the lateral when the air is released from both sides. Other aspects of sound production, that is glottis state, voiced, voiceless, murmured, laryngalized and closed. Part of tongue involved apical, laminal and dorsal or subapical. These are the primary places of articulation. Here we are summarizing all that we have seen till now: bilabial, labiodental, dental, alveolar, retroflex, alveopalatal, palatoalveolar, palatal, velar, uvula, pharyngeal and labiovelar. Manner of articulation could be stop, fricative, approximant, trill, flap, tap and affricate. Centrality, and you can have both central and lateral sounds. Nasality, can have both oral and nasal sounds. And among stops, these are the different kinds of stops which are possible. We can have voice stops, voiceless unaspirated, aspirated, murmured, breathy sounds, implosives, laryngalized or creaky sounds, which we will see in phonation part. The ejectives, which you have already seen, the nasal release, so sounds which are released with the nasal, and then prenasalized sounds, and these are two types of stops that where we can have a nasal release and prenasalized, and we can have lateral release, we can have ejectives which are laterally released, and then of course there are many types of affricates. Again, summarizing many of the things that we have discussed since the last class. So nasals, stops, fricatives can contrast along the bilabial dimension. Fricatives and nasals have labiodental. There are no stops are generally cannot be labiodentals, and in the dental place of articulation all three are possible. Alveolar, all three are possible. Retroflex, also nasal stop fricatives are possible. Palatoalveolar place of articulation, fricatives are often seen and not stops and nasals. In the palatal region, all three of them. In the velar region, all three manner of articulation. In uvular also, all three manners of articulation are possible. In the pharyngeal region, it's mostly fricatives, and in labial velar place of articulation we find only nasals and stops. Again, summarizing the entire list of things that we have seen so far: airstream mechanism, we can have pulmonic, glottalic, velaric. Direction can be aggressive, ingressive. Glottis can be voiced, voiceless, murmured, laryngalized and closed. Tongue could be apical, lapinal, neither. Bilabial, so these are all the places of articulation we just saw. Centrality and lateral, and nasality can be either oral or nasal, and these are the 6 manners of articulation possible. These are the symbols. Thank you for your attention. We will continue in the next class, and we will continue with the sounds of the world's languages. We'll see how vowels can be different, and we will see a bit more on phonation, and then we will wrap up this section on sounds of the world's languages. Thank you for your attention again.